Hey guys, we are finally wrapping up our coverage of the Amazing Race 36 with a team ranking. So here I'll be ranking all 13 teams from the season based off the races that they ran during the season. And this is a pretty straightforward list, and while there's some interesting placements, I feel like there's some pretty obvious ones as well. But there are 13 teams to talk about. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 13, the team that I believe ran the worst race on the season is Maya and Rowan, the first boots of the season. And for the most part, they're your pretty standard first boots. Now, I actually do feel bad for them considering they were these massive super fans coming into it, and you can very much tell that they wanted to do well. But really, the race here is pretty bad, where they got lost on the way to the first detour, and really from that point on, they had no way of recovering. They were pretty much in last place the entire time. And for the most part, there isn't really that much you can really prop up their races. Now, again, they do get unlucky in the fact that they do get lost along the way, but considering that's the entirety of their race, I feel like there's not really much to prop up there, which is why they're here at number 13. Now, moving on to number 12, we have the second boots of the season, and here we have Chris and Mary. And I really like Chris and Mary. I feel like they're a pretty likable team for the most part, but you can very clearly tell they were not meant for the race, where Chris was obviously not in the best shape in the world given his age, and that really held up the team during both legs, where they do all right in the first leg, getting an 11th place finish there, and they were even in 7th place at the start of the first detour, but then they fall right back down to last place. And while there was a point where it seemed like they could have recovered, I feel like at the point of that roadblock, they were pretty much doomed to go out in the spot that they did. So on the whole, not the greatest team in the world, but they at least survived a leg. They at least were not in last place the entire time, but really they were the second boost of the season, which is why they're here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we are deviating slightly from the boot order, but not too much, but we do have Kishori and Karishma. And it was pretty close between them and the next team we'll be talking about, but obviously they're a pretty bad team as well, really being in the back of the pack for most of the race here, where they start off with two 10th place finishes in a row, and while they do jump a little bit up to 8th place in leg 3, they're right back down to second to last in leg 4, and then they're booted in 9th place. It's really a bad race for the most part, where the only point in the entire race where they seem to be in the top half is during leg 1, but even then they completely blow their lead on the way to the first pit stop, which causes them to fall to 10th place, and they really are unable to recover afterwards. So they're this team that, while they could theoretically get a good place in from time to time, I feel like at the first moment that they face adversity, they just don't have it in them to really recover, which is a big reason they're here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have a team pretty similar to Kishori and Karishma, even though they were booted around earlier, and that is Michelle and Sean. And really, I feel like Michelle and Sean are a very similar team to Kishori and Karishma. They're this team that once they fall behind, they really are unable to recover, which is funny considering they actually do all right in leg 1, where they actually managed to squeak out a 5th place finish there. But even then, it's really only in that final scramble to the pit stop that allows them to jump up to 5th place. Really before that, they're hovering around the 8 to 10 spot. But after that first leg, it goes completely downhill for them, where they fall all the way to last place at the start of that detour, and they barely survive leg 2, getting second to last there. They also get second to last in leg 3, and then they're booted in leg 4 in 10th place. It's a pretty bad race for the most part, and they're not too far off from Kishori and Karishma. But the main reason I do have them above Kishori and Karishma is that they at least had a decent finish. They at least got 5th place in leg 1. And while you can question how they got there to begin with, I feel like with these teams being pretty similar, the fact that their average placement is technically better than Kishori and Karishma's was enough to have them here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have the earliest boots left on the board to talk about. And here we have Anthony and Bailey. And obviously Anthony and Bailey are a pretty weird team to talk about considering they have a pretty disastrous leg 3 that results in their elimination, where they just keep going back and forth between the detours. That very much sinks their chances of surviving there. So it's obviously a terrible leg there. But I do feel like compared to the other teams we already talked about, I feel like they were a more consistent team where, yeah, they weren't great. They got 2 8th place finishes in a row, but I feel like they were at least a bit more consistent than the other teams we already talked about, where at least they were consistent in their placements. I also feel like I have slightly more faith in them to make it deeper into the race had they survived that particular leg, even though a lot of their downfall is their own doing there. So again, I'm not saying they're a good team by any means, but I feel like the fact that they go out in a pretty wonky way, where it's really coming down to that one task that really destroys any chances that they have of staying, I feel like that was enough to have them above the likes of Kishore and Karishma and Michelle and Sean, but still they're pretty bad teams, so they're here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another team that I find pretty mediocre, even though they technically made it further than another team we'll be talking about, but we do have Sunny and Busy. And Sunny and Busy are a pretty mediocre team, all things considered, where they're really in the back of the pack the entire time, never getting a finish above 7th place. And also there being multiple points where they could have been booted earlier, like in leg 4, they were in last place for a lot of that, but made a recovery by the end of it. Leg 5, similar thing, they spent a lot of that leg in last place, but really recovered by the end of it. And they're basically a team that's just scraping on by through a lot of it. Though I think a major pro you can give them is the fact that they are able to recover, considering that there are multiple points where they were in last place, but are able to do well in certain tasks that allows them to leapfrog other teams. I do think that's something you can at least praise them for. And I think if I were ranking these teams based on their potential to do well in any given season, I think that would definitely be a pro to give them. But considering the fact that they are very rarely in the top half of the pack, mixing in the fact that they were still in last place for a decent chunk of the race, makes it so that I can't really have them any higher than here, even though they do technically get 7th place by the end of it, but I do have them here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we're once again jumping forward a bit in the boot order here, and this may be a bit of an unpopular pick, but I stand by it, and here we have Yvonne and Melissa. Now Yvonne and Melissa are an interesting team considering they do make it all the way to the final 5, and they're a mostly consistent team where they never get a finish below 7th place. Now they do have their missteps along the way, where in leg 4 they really struggle on that detour, causing them to fall all the way to 9th place, though they're able to scrape by with a 7th place finish by the end of the leg. You also have the final 7 leg, where they spend a good chunk of that leg in the bottom 2, and it's not until the tail end that they manage to get by with a 5th place finish there. But I think for the most part, they are a mostly consistent team. Again, very little variation in terms of the actual placements. The reason I don't have them higher, though, is I feel like other teams we'll be talking about soon have higher highs than them, where other teams we'll be talking about soon have top 3 finishes. They even have wins on their resumes. I feel like with Yvonne and Melissa, though, they're just pretty mediocre, and they're never really able to step it up either, to where by the end, they just run out of runway, and they're eventually taken out at the final 5, which I think is pretty fitting there. So I feel like considering how mid they are for pretty much the entire race, I can't really have them too much higher than here, considering other teams have higher highs, which is why they're here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have the earliest boots left on the board to talk about, and here we have Derek and Shalisa. Now obviously Derek and Shalisa are booted earlier than Yvonne and Melissa. They get 8th place while Yvonne and Melissa get 5th. However, Derek and Shalisa also have a pretty strong start to the race, where they get 3 3rd place finishes in a row to start off the race. They are very much in the top of the pack, along with Ricky and Cesar and Ron and Letitia competing for those top spots. And I feel like that's a major pro to give them. That's way better than anything Yvonne and Melissa are ever able to do across any individual leg. And that's a big reason why I had them above them. Now, obviously, they do kind of fall off afterwards, where in leg 4, they do fall to 6th place there. That's not particularly great. In leg 5, they barely survive, getting second to last there, and then they're booted the very next leg. They obviously have a pretty noticeable downturn after those first 3 legs, but the fact that they had that strong start to begin with is more than I can say about the other teams we already talked about, where even with the likes of Michelle and Sean, I feel like for them, they only got 5th place in leg 1, and then they dropped off much more dramatically. I feel like Derek and Shalisa, they are able to hang on a couple more legs after they fall off the top 3, not to mention they are in the top 3 for longer to begin with. So I feel like despite them being earlier boots than some other teams, I feel like they're still a team that has higher highs than those other teams, which is why they're here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I very much debated these next 2. I didn't really know what to do with them, as I feel like they both have their pros and cons to them. But at number 5, I did decide to go with the earlier boots, even though they were arguably screwed over in the race, but we do have Angie and Danny. And I think they're a tough team to assess, considering I think they had potential at the time they got taken out, and I feel like their race as a whole is probably better than what their pure track record says. Now early on, they're pretty middle of the road, getting 7th place in leg 1, 6th place in leg 2, and while they stumble in leg 3, falling all the way to 9th place, we see them recover very well in leg 4, getting back up to 3rd place. After that, we see them align with the likes of Raw, Letitia, and Amber and Vinny that allows them to get through the mega leg. And while their leg 6 is pretty mediocre, falling to 5th place, we then see them jumping back up in leg 7 to 2nd place. And really, they seem to be in a pretty good spot coming into that final 6 round, only for them to lose a lot of time in their boot round due to a very weird circumstance where they end up getting separated from their production crew that causes them to have to sit out and wait for them to catch up, causing them to lose a lot of time there. But the funny thing is, even afterwards, they were still second to last to the detour. They weren't even in last place at that point to where they could have survived that. But obviously, they eventually get taken out there. So it's obviously a very weird race to talk about where I feel like at points they definitely were a strong team. And even at the points where their placements weren't as impressive, a lot of that was because they were working alongside Ron, Letitia, and Amber and Vinny. And yes, while there were some issues such as Danny being prone to help out other teams when it didn't really benefit them, I feel like they still had a lot of momentum at the time they were taken out, to where had they survived that leg, I would have had some faith in them to potentially make it run at the end. Now, obviously, they still have their missteps along the way, but I feel like the fact that they were a pretty strong team on the whole is a big reason why I had them this high. But at the end of the day, I feel like the next teams we'll be talking about have more impressive elements in their game and better finishes, which is why they're here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the other team that I was deliberating with Angie and Danny, but we do have Amber and Vinny, the 4th place finishers on the season. Now, similar to Angie and Danny, they were definitely prone to having their issues. Like, they got into a ton of fights over the course of the season. There was a lot of bickering between them, which is obviously pretty funny to watch. But I feel like as a team, they definitely had a slightly stronger track record, in my eyes at least, compared to Angie and Danny. Now, obviously, they have a very rough start where they barely survived leg 1, getting second to last there, which is obviously pretty bad. But I feel like by leg 2, they start to really turn up, where they get 7th place in leg 2, and they're able to pull out a 2nd place finish in leg 3 after Vinny is able to blow through the roadblock, which I find pretty impressive there. And really from that point on, they never fall below 4th place again, which I find pretty impressive. And I feel like they were a slightly more consistent team compared to Angie and Danny, obviously outlasting Angie and Danny by 2 whole rounds. You also have their boot round where they come very close to surviving, where considering that Ricky and Cesar really struggled on that final roadblock, they were very much in the thick of things, and had Ricky and Cesar taken just a little more time to finish that roadblock, they would have been in the final leg in a spot where they probably would have a good shot at winning. So I feel like the fact that Amber and Vinny come relatively close to being in a winning position by the end of it is pretty impressive in my eyes, and the fact that they are pretty consistent outside of the first 2 legs is pretty impressive in my eyes. But I feel like the top 3 teams have more pros for me, and at the end of the day, they never actually win a leg, which is also a knock against them. That kind of leaves them behind at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and obviously we have the top 3 now, the final 3 of the season, and the only 3 teams to actually win a leg in the season, which I find really insane. It's just a matter of ordering them. But number 3, and this may be a bit controversial here, but I have my rationale, but we do have Juan and Shane, the 2nd place finishers of the season. And I think it's pretty close between them and the number 2 team, as I feel like their track records are extremely similar, where they never fall below 6th place the entire race, which is pretty impressive. They also spend about half the race in the top 3, which is also pretty good. Mind you, they only win 1 leg over the course of the season, that being the mega leg, which is definitely a consideration over why they're lower than a number 2 team. And they also have 1 second to last finish, that being the final 7 round, which is obviously not great, though the number 2 team has a similar issue. So I feel like for the most part, Juan and Shane are a mostly solid team here, running a pretty consistent race for the most part, very rarely being in the back of the pack. And yes, while they do have some missteps along the way, I feel like they're a pretty strong team. And obviously they came closer to winning compared to the number 2 team by the end of it. I feel like that's something to consider at least. But I feel like the number 2 team was a bit more dominant in the race while having a similar level of consistency, which leaves them behind at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have the other runners-up of the season, and here we have Rod and Letitia. And I think you can definitely debate them being below Juan and Shane, considering they have a lower low compared to Juan and Shane, that being the final 6 round where Angie and Danny go home, where they barely survived that round, where despite Angie and Danny losing a lot of time due to them getting separated from their camera crew, Rod and Letitia are still behind them at the point where they get to the detour, and with them getting their car stuck in the mud, they very well could have been eliminated there had Angie and Danny not have been forced to stop for their production crew. So I feel like they get very much lucked out by that situation. You also have the final leg where Juan and Shane technically beat them there, so I think that's another knock there. So I think there are definitely knocks you can point to with Rod and Letitia, but the reason that I have them above Juan and Shane is I think their highs are slightly higher. where while Juan Shane only won one leg over the course of the season, Ron Letitia won 3 legs, with them winning the first 2 legs of the season and then winning the penultimate leg of the season, which I think is pretty impressive on their end. They also never have a finish below 5th place, which is slightly better than Juan and Shane, and they spent a similar amount of time within the top 3 of the pack compared to Juan and Shane. So I feel like just looking at their track record, it is a slight improvement over Juan and Shane. And while they technically come closer to being eliminated in the round where they were second to last compared to the round where Juan and Shane were second to last, I feel like the fact that their highs are slightly higher, not to mention that they were involved in that alliance that dominated the couple of legs in the middle, I feel like those pros were just enough to edge out Juan and Shane on this list to where I had them here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the team that I believe ran the best race on the Amazing Race 36 are the winners of the season, and here we have Ricky and Cesar. And Ricky and Cesar ran the most dominant race in the Amazing Race history, not just in the US, but also worldwide, where they achieved a level of dominance that we rarely see on the show. 7 wins, never getting a finish below 3rd place. If we're cutting out the final 4 leg, never being outside the top 2 at any point across the race, and having an average placement of 1.45, smashing Eric and Jeremy's record, while being able to finish the job of actually winning the race. I feel like Ricky and Cesar's game essentially speaks for itself, to where the only misstep they make the entire race is that final 4 roadblock, where that obviously is really bad. That nearly cost them the entire race, where Amber and Vinny were right behind them as they were getting to the pit stop there. But really, outside of that, they were still doing well in that final 4 leg anyway up to that roadblock. But if we're taking that out, they pretty much ran a near perfect race, where they do start off the race being in the top 2, being behind Raw and Letitia during those first 2 legs, but then leg 3, they take the lead, they win the next 3 legs in a row. They do fall to 2nd place during the mega leg, being behind Juan and Shane the entire time, though at the same time they're able to be ahead of that alliance that was all working together on the various tasks. But then after the mega leg, they are able to win the next 3 legs in a row. Obviously, they stumble at the final 4, but even then, they were still leading before the roadblock in question. And then they win the final leg in dominant fashion, where I think that's another thing to point out is that they weren't just winning legs. There were multiple legs where they completely blew every other team out of the water, winning with such a massive lead over them, despite them having these staggered starts where each team was leaving groups, leaving 15 minutes at a time. The fact that they were still able to continually get out in front is really impressive in my eyes. Now, I know there are people online that have tried to demerit from the race, talking about how the route was very favorable to them, going through a lot of Spanish-speaking countries in a spot where they knew the language, talking about how a lot of tasks were very easy for them considering they somehow had experience in all of them, as well as the competition not being the fiercest in the world, especially for comparing it to the likes of Rachel and Dave or Megan and Shane or some of these other dominant teams in the show's history. And while I would have to consider those things if I were to ever make a top 10 amazing race scenes of all time video, I feel like if we were just looking at the race that they ran on this particular season, I feel like that doesn't take away from how dominant they ran on the race, where I feel like the language thing in particular is kind of overblown, where I feel like people just act like no one else knew Spanish at all when it was pretty clear that other teams were at least somewhat familiar with the language. But it also doesn't explain how they were able to dominate all the tasks. It doesn't explain how they were able to work well as a team. And again, just taking those things out, if we're just looking at the pure results, they ran the most dominant race in the Amazing Race history. I mean, if I were to do a winner ranking of the Amazing Race, they're number 1. I mean, they kind of have to be number 1, if I'm being honest. So again, I don't really buy into a lot of these arguments talking about how their race is not as impressive, or I feel like the only way those things would truly matter would be if they ever come back for an all-star season where they're going up against stronger competition and going to different countries that speak different languages. But even then, I still think they're a pretty strong team. They're definitely by far the best team on the season. And I feel like just taking a look at their results, I feel like the results speak for themselves. So for me, it's not even a question that they ran the best race on the season, which is why they're here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. Now, I'm still covering Survivor 46, so you can expect coverage of that show. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, feel free to click the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.